Hi, my name is Bob Beechell, and in this second tutorial on using ggplot2, what I'm going to be looking at is how to draw some other types of graphs, specifically line charts and bar charts. And I'll finish off by considering a couple of the other features of ggplot2. Firstly, what we call facets, and secondly, the built-in themes. So the first thing to do is to load up the tidyverse into memory. And this, of course, will give me the ggplot package that I need. If you're not using the tidyverse, you can simply load up ggplot itself. Okay, now I'm going to read in some data. I'm going to read in some time series data into a tibble, so that which I'll then use to draw a line graph. So that reads my data in. Just have a quick look at it. Okay, it's a tibble consisting of three variables, a date variable, a year here. It's not a date variable as such, it's a double, but the years, and then two numeric variables, one for the savings ratio, one for the Gini coefficient. This is for the UK 1964 to 2013 annual data. So let me draw a simple line graph of the savings ratio against time, of course, against year. Now we've seen how to create a basic graph in ggplot. You start, of course, with ggplot, and then, of course, in brackets you first of all put the data set, the tibble, comma, and then the aesthetics, the x variable, and the y variable. And then, of course, you specify what type of graph you want with one of the geom functions, in this case geom underscore line. I haven't included any options for color and so on as yet, just to give you the basics. So if we run that, we get a very basic line graph, which by default, of course, is reasonably good. So the default color for the line is black, and this is the default width, and of course for the axis labels it simply uses the variable names. Now we've seen, of course, how to, in the previous graph, how to format this, to add a title, to format the title, to add better axis labels, and change the colour of the line and so on. So I'm just going to do all that here in the way we've shown before. So as you can see, I've now changed the colour of the line to this particular one. I've increased the size to 1 to make it a bit wider. I've added a title with GG title, a better axis label for the y-axis. I haven't changed the x-axis, that's okay. I've then formatted the title in the way I did in the previous video, and then I've modified the scales, again using these two functions here, these two options, scale underscore x underscore continuous, and same one for y, using, I covered this in the previous video, so you'll see how to do this. So if we, now, in fact, what I've also done here is that I'm not going to print this out immediately. I've actually assigned this graph to an object. You'll see the reasons for that later. So having assigned it to an object, to get the actual graph, I just need to print out that object. So let me run this. So that created the graph in P1. Let me now simply print out P1 on the console, which in effect will print out the graph. And there we can see what we get. It's much better now. I've got a nice title, I've got a better scale, and so on. So that's using the things that I looked at in the previous video. Now let me draw a similar graph here for the other variable, the Gini coefficient, the inequality measure. So all this is the same, except of course the y variable is now inequality. I'm also using a different colour for that, and obviously an appropriate title and appropriate axis scales. So again, I've initially assign that to an object, P2, which I'm now going to print out. And then we have the nice looking graph, line graph for the Gini coefficient. So as you can see, very easy to create line graphs in ggplot. It's the same basic way of creating any chart. The key, you always start with ggplot and telling it the data set and the x and y variables as the aesthetics, and then you tell it what particular type of graph you want, and then you can add your formatting. Now sometimes, of course, with line graphs you want to display two or more variables on the same graph, so that it's a multiple line graph. Now this is appropriate, of course, if the y-axis and the x-axis are the same for both graphs in terms of the actual scale. And this is the case here. They both have year on the horizontal axis and percent on the vertical, so I can put them on a single graph. Doing that is very straightforward. It's the same basic procedure, but you simply include as many geom line options as are required. So notice the syntax here. Again, ggplot, the tibble. This time, however, I'm only specifying the common x-axis here. I'm including the y variable in the specific geom line options. So notice that it's an aesthetic. Of course, you have to put that in the AES part. And notice here too, you have to actually say y equals. If you just put save ratio, it doesn't seem to work. Here, of course, you don't need to necessarily put y equals. It takes this to be the y variable, but here you do have to specify it. And also, in order to get different colors, you specify color equals, and then you put in a text, a string to indicate what name is going to be used in the legend, which you will obviously create with two lines. Of course, you need a legend to distinguish, to make it clear which one is which. So you specify that there. So that's for the save ratio. For the inequality, same thing, geom line, but this time y is equality, color equals, and then again some label for the legend. Also, in fact, it will also, if you tell it not, if you don't tell it not to, it will include a little title to the legend, which is usually not very appropriate. In fact, in this case, I think it would use the word color, which is not really what I want. So you can prevent that by using this syntax here, guides, and in brackets color equals guide underscore legend, then in brackets title equals no. So it's slightly long syntax here, but this, as you can see, is effectively going to tell it not to put a title. The rest is familiar. GG title, ylab, theme to format the title, and then the formatting the scales, the axes scales. So if I run that, we'll see what we get. There we are. As you can see, a nice graph. Let me just increase that. So, as you can see, we've got a nice double line graph here, one with an appropriate legend. I've stopped it from putting a title to the legend here because it would have just said, I believe, color, which is not, obviously you don't need that. So again, that's a very nice looking graph which you can get from using ggplot. Okay, if you actually want to plot a couple of variables which are in different units, so they'll have different scales, then of course you can't plot them on the same graph, but you could still plot them as one graph on top of another or side by side, and although it's not possible to do that directly in ggplot2, or if it is, I'm not aware of how to do it, fortunately one of the authors of ggplot, Winston Chang, has written a nice little function which you can freely use to do this. It's a function called multiplot, and it's available on his website here. I'll be in fact talking about this website in more detail at the end of this tutorial. You can go here, access the code, and then save it as a function, which you can then load up as required. Now if you don't know how to save and load functions, you can find out how to do that in my video on functions. So here I've created this, I've copied the code and I've saved it as a function called multiplot, which I think is the name that Chang himself uses, and I'm simply going to load it up into memory using the load command. Now notice here I'm assuming that this function is in my working directory, so I only need to specify the name. If not, then of course you'd have to either change the working directory appropriately or put in the full path. So let me load this up. There we go. Now, so this is now loaded up. It's in my environment. I won't actually show you the code here. You can see it for yourself on the website. Now what you do with this function is very easily. You simply include as arguments to the function graphs, graphical objects. So this is why up here I saved these two graphs into variables, into objects P1 and P2, so I could put them in here. Now by default, if you simply specify the objects, and you're not limited to, I believe, I think you can use 3 or more, it will put them one on top of each other. If you want, say, 4 graphs to be in a 2x2 grid, you can. There is an option to do that, which you can find on the details on the web page. So let me run this, and you'll see that I'm going to get my 2 graphs here, my 2 line graphs, one on top of the other, but a separate graph this time. Well, there we are. So it's very neat. It does it very quickly. So now, of course, with these 2 variables, I could put them on the same graph because they had the same x and y scales. But if they didn't, then you could plot them like this. As you can see, it's you get a very nice single-page printout. So this multiplot function is well worth getting hold of. Okay, so now let's have a look at how to draw some bar charts. So in order to do this, I'm going to read in some data, and I'm going to use the data that I used in my 2 tutorials on using the tidyverse, which is this simple hypothetical data about social media use. So let me read that in. I'm using, of course, read_CSV, which is part of the tidyverse, so it reads it into a tibble. Let's have a quick look at it. So this is the one I used before in the tidyverse tutorials. 3 variables, 2 character variables, 1 for gender, 1 for site, and 1 numeric variable showing usage out in terms of hours per week. Now let me draw a bar chart here of this. So first of all, I'll start with a very simple bar chart where it's simply going to show the total usage per hours by gender. Now to do this, again obviously ggplot, then the name of the tibble, and then the aesthetics, the x-axis variable, horizontal axis, and the vertical axis. go_bar, because we want a bar chart now. Now notice this option here is very important, stat equals identity. That tells it to use the actual data in your data set rather than to convert it into something else. So let me run that and we'll see what we get. So what we get is a very basic bar chart. It's, as you can see, it's shown on here. We got gender, female and male, usage up here, and what it's done in fact is it's found the sum of the hours usage in by females and by males. So in terms of my data set here, it's looked at the males and added up the usage for each man and then give me the total, and the same for female. So that's what you'll get if you just use the basic geombar function here. If you want, of course, to graph other types of bar chart, then you're going to need to create the tibble to do that. Now I showed how to do this in the tidyverse tutorial. I showed how to use the group by option in order to create various groupings, various cross tabulations and so on, or frequencies. So I'm going to do that here first. Now notice what I'm doing, how I'm doing this here. I'm using what's called the pipe, which is something that's become an integral part of the tidyverse. It's this, the syntax here is this, percentage greater than percentage. This is often read as then. Remember that the assignment operator you can often read as gets. This is then. So what this does, in fact, it's a way of combining different functions without having to put one function inside the other, which of course can lead to loads of brackets and potential syntax problems because you miss off brackets and so on. I'm going to be doing an actual tutorial on the pipe in more detail, but here you can see, I think, how it works. So let me run this, which has now created this grouping, which in frequent, this object here, freak_gender. If I run it, if I display it, you'll see exactly, here it is. So this repeats what I did in the tidyverse tutorial, but using the pipe. So it's now found the number of females in my dataset and the number of males, which I can then, so it's a basic frequency distribution of gender, which I can then plot. Now notice the two variables are gender on the x-axis and n on the vertical, so that's what I need to put into the ggplot function here. So I'm using this tibble, frequency gender, with these two variables x and y to create a bar chart. I'm putting stat equals empty to make sure it uses these actual values. I'm now also going to change the color of the bars with the fill, and I'm going to put a red border around with color. I'm not going to bother here by putting a title and better axis labels and modifying the scales and so on, because you've seen how to do all that up here and seen it before. So let me run this, and you can see it's exactly what I want. It's drawn a nice bar chart of this frequency table for females 9 and males 11. As I say, you can easily add a title and better axis labels and so on in the usual way. Let's have a look now at how to create a more complicated bar chart. So for this, I'm going to create the grouping that I did in the tidyverse tutorial, looking at the mean hourly usage, the mean usage per hour categorized by gender and site, a kind of cross-tabulation, which I'm then going to illustrate. I'm going to show it as a bar chart. So first of all, let me create the grouping. Now, again, I'm using the syntax that I used in the tidyverse tutorial. However, I'm using the pipe as before. So as you can see here, I'm assigning to this variable mean usage. Well, first of all, I'm creating the grouping here with the group_by function. Now remember to group by one, and then another variable, you simply put them in order like this. This is all explained in the tidyverse tutorial. I then pipe the output of that, the tibble that outputs, into the summarize function. So notice, of course, I don't have to specify the normal first argument here, which is the tibble, because it takes it from the pipe. So all I need to do is to create this variable, this summary variable, which is the mean. So this is putting into one line what I think I used 3 lines in the original, in the tidyverse tutorial. So let me run that. And a quick look at it, and you'll see here it is. Here's the tibble. Here's the effect of the cross tabulation that I've created. It breaks down hourly usage, average hourly usage, mean usage, by first of all gender and then site. So clearly this needs to be drawn as a kind of grouped bar chart, or alternatively as a stacked bar chart, and I'll show both. Let's first of all look at how to do a grouped bar chart. So here's the syntax of ggplot, the tibble, mean usage. Now the x-axis is site. On the y-axis, the average use, the mean use. Now in order to show gender as well, I'm going to use this option in ggplot, which I looked at in the previous, in the first tutorial on ggplot, whereby you can use an additional variable as a categorizing variable by including it here and setting it equal to some aesthetic, some property, such as in this case the fill color. So I'm setting fill equal to gender. Notice I've actually put x equals and y equals here. You probably don't need to do that. You could probably just put site, comma, image as usage, but this is fine. Okay, so it's a bar chart, of course. Now, we've seen stat equals identity before, so it uses the actual values here. I'm going to change the outline of the bars to black. Now the other option we haven't seen here, which is necessary here, is this, position equals dodge. That tells it to put a gap between the two groupings, as you'll see. If you don't do that, it will not create a group bar chart, it will create a stacked bar chart. So if you want a grouped bar chart, then you need to position equals dodge. If you're not sure what I mean by a group bar chart, let me draw it and you'll see exactly. This is it. So here we have shown average usage up here, site along here, and then we've also distinguished by gender by using the fill option here as another aesthetic. So as you can see, it's then filled with different colours, the colours indicating the gender. I think I did actually draw this chart in the tidyverse, one of the tidyverse tutorials, possibly the second one, but here we can see exactly how it's working. So notice this important option here, position equals dodge, which will get you this kind of bar chart here where the genders are grouped. Now, as I say, if you want, you might alternatively want to draw a stacked bar chart where instead of having the genders side by side, you have one on top of the other. So it's easy enough to do that. All you have to do is to exclude the position equals dodge option. If you don't include that, it will draw it as a stacked bar chart. So as you can see, this is exactly the same as that, except I've omitted the position equals dodge option. So running it, you'll see that we get a stacked bar chart like that. So here, gender, again, we still get a nice legend here, but rather than gender, male and female being put as side by side bars, one stacked on top of the other. And you may prefer that, because then of course this will be the total average use of Facebook and Pinterest and so on. That's one way of dealing with a couple of variables, dealing with a cross tabulation like this. The other way you can do it in ggplot2 is to use what are called facets. Facets are another way of using a third categorizing variable, but this time they do that by having two graphs adjacent to each other, either one on top of each other or side by side. So here I'm going to again plot this mean usage distribution that we looked at, that I've already plotted using a group bar chart and a stacked bar chart, but this time as two separate graphs. Now to do this, you use this additional option here, facet underscore grid, and then in brackets you put the variable that's going to be the categorizing variable, just as I did up here, gender in this case, a little tilde, and then a dot. This is the way you get two graphs, one on top of each other. So let's see that. Everything else, of course, is just the same. Notice, of course, since you're using a facet, you don't put the fill equals gender in here. So let me run that. And as you can see, this is what we get. So this time it's using gender to distinguish between the two sets of data in effect here. So this shows the mean usage by site for women, females, and for males. Notice it puts these facet labels here. Now, in fact, those are not particularly useful at the moment, just F and M. It'd be better if it said men and women or female and male. I'll show how to change that shortly. Notice too that it's simply used the standard a standard colour for both of the sets of bars here in both graphs. You can change that. Again, I'll show that shortly. But let me just show how to do this with the graph side by side, which you may prefer. It's very simple. All you need to change is this thing here. Instead of putting gender, tittle, and then a dot, you put it the other way around, as you can see here. A dot, tittle, and then gender. So running that, we'll see we get the same thing, but side by side like that, which I think in this case looks better. So again, female, male. So it's separating out, it's using the gender variable to separate out the results, but using two separate graphs rather than a group, say a grouped bar chart. Now, as I say, as you can see again, we're just getting the same colours on both. Now, if you want to avoid that, what you do, in fact, is you revert back to putting fill equals gender in. That effectively tells it to use different colours for gender, but because you've got the facet underscore grid option, that will override this, so you won't get a group bar chart as we did here. You will get a faceted graph. So if I run that, you'll see. Oh yeah, that looks better, I think. It's using this. It's ggplot's using its standard colours by default. So, and this time, of course, we get a legend. I don't think we had that before, did we? No, of course, there was no need for a legend before because they're the same colours. But this time we get one. But if you think about it here, the legend is redundant because we've already got these facet labels to indicate that these are the female figures and these are for male. So in this case, the legend, which is generated because we use the fill equal gender option, is actually redundant. So we can get rid of that. And also, you might in fact prefer your own colours here rather than the default ones. And again, that's possible. And we can see that here. So here, what I've done is I've added two things here. Firstly, scale underscore fill underscore manual, and then values equals, and then a little vector. So as you can see, what this is doing is telling it to use these two colours, red and green, rather than the default ones. So obviously you can put any colours in there you like. So it's telling to fill, instead of filling the bars automatically, it's filling them manually with my chosen colours. Secondly, I've included this option here, guides, fill equals false. That will tell it not to put a legend. So let's have a look now what we get. Okay, so the same graph, this time however no legend, and my specific colours. Now I'm not saying these are the best colours to use, they're a bit bright, but so you might want to choose some different ones, but as you can see you can easily choose your own colours here. Okay, the final thing I think that this requires is to have better facet labels here. F and M it's clear what they mean, female and male, but it would be better to say use female and male or men and women. Now you can do that again straightforwardly by including an additional option here in the facet underscore grid command here. So here's what I had before to give me side by side. Now you include this option here, labeler equals labeler in brackets, gender, the categorizing variable, in this case gender, equals, then again a little vector which specifies that you want F to actually be replaced by, in this case I've gone for women rather than female, and M to be replaced by men. So a little long there, but say once you've done this once, of course you can easily copy and paste it. So this is going to draw me the same graph, but instead of putting F and M, it will say women and men. And there we have it. So that's looking a good chart. And obviously it needs a title and a different and a better label here and so on. Of course we've already seen how to do that a number of times. Okay, so there's just one final thing that I want to look at here on the ggplot2, and that's how you can use themes as a overall formatting option. And you can use built-in themes or you can use your own themes. I'm just going to simply look at the built-in themes here. So what I've got here is I'm going back to this line graph here, this multiple line graph where I plotted the savings ratio and the Gini coefficient on the same graph, which if I just go back is, I've done quite a few of course, more than I thought. This one, well, I've just gone too far. This one, of course, is what I drew before, where I specified my own formatting for the title and allowed it to then use the basic default background here. Now, if you want to maybe have a different style, you can use one of the built-in themes, such as this one here, theme underscore BW, which obviously stands for black and white. So what I've done here is I've gone back to the code here for this particular graph. However, I've removed the option to format the title because I'm going to allow the built-in theme to use whatever it decides, whatever the built-in theme uses. You can in fact put some options in here to change things, change the font and so on. I'm not going to do that. You can find the details of that in a book I'm going to be recommending shortly. but here I'm just illustrating how to use one of the built-in themes which you might be happy with. So let's run that and we'll see how it compares to this one over here. Okay, you can see you get a slightly different look. No longer the light grey background, it's just white. The title obviously is no longer as it was before because that was my formatting, and it's using a default font. And in fact that looks rather neat, I think, and clear, so it may be a theme that you're quite happy with. As I say, it is possible to modify this built-in theme and also create your own themes. But that's something that you'll be able to look at for yourself now that you have a good idea of how to use ggplot2. So that completes these two tutorials I've been doing on using ggplot2. Now if you want more information, you can go to the ggplot2 reference page, which is here, or better, go to the Cookbook for R page, a site by Winston Chang, which I mentioned earlier. And in fact, on there you'll find a link to Winston Chang's book, which is called R Graphics Cookbook. And that is an excellent source of loads of tips and techniques for really getting the most out of ggplot2.